Chapter 1. An Unexpected Visitor at Baker Street. It was a dreary November evening in London, the sort where fog clung to the corners of buildings and lamplight struggled to penetrate the gloom. Rain had fallen steadily throughout the day, turning the cobblestones slick and forcing pedestrians to hurry past with collars turned up against the chill. I had spent most of the afternoon by the fire in our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, occasionally glancing up from my medical journal to observe my friend and fellow lodger, Sherlock Holmes, who had been in a peculiar mood for several days. Holmes had not had a case of significance for nearly 3 weeks, and the idleness weighed heavily upon his active mind. He sat cross-legged in his armchair, surrounded by newspaper clippings, his pipe sending plumes of blue smoke toward the ceiling. His lean fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest as his keen grey eyes scanned the crime reports with evident disappointment. "Nothing, Watson," he declared suddenly, flinging the papers aside. "Not a single problem worthy of intellectual consideration. Is it possible that the criminal classes have taken a collective holiday?" I chuckled, setting down my journal. "Perhaps they've been deterred by your reputation, Holmes. Your successes have been rather well documented of late. Flattery, my dear Watson, will not alleviate this insufferable boredom." He rose in a single fluid motion and began to pace the room. "The human mind rebels against stagnation. It requires problems work, the music of logical deduction, else it begins to fester." "You might consider a holiday yourself," I suggested. "The countryside." "The countryside harbours just as many dark secrets as London," Holmes interrupted with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The difference being that rural crimes often lack the sophistication one finds in the metropolis." I could respond. We were interrupted by the sharp ring of the doorbell, followed by the sound of our landlady's footsteps on the stairs. Holmes paused in his pacing, his head tilted slightly, listening. "A client, Watson," he murmured, his eyes brightening with sudden interest. "Female, approximately 30 years of age, of good breeding but in a state of considerable distress. She has come in a hansom, travelled some distance despite the inclement weather, and is carrying something of significance in her right hand." Stared at him in astonishment. "How could you possibly know all that before she has even entered the room?" A ghost of a smile played across his lips. The bell was pulled with force, but not sustained, suggesting urgency rather than impatience. The footsteps on the stairs include Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread, alongside a lighter, quicker step. A woman's, certainly. The rustle of quality fabric suggests a lady of means, while the irregular pattern of her steps indicates emotional agitation. That moment, Mrs. Hudson opened the door and announced, "Miss Elellanena Thornfield to see you, Mr. Holmes." The woman who entered our sitting room confirmed several of Holmes's deductions immediately. She was indeed young, perhaps 28 or 30, dressed in a fashionable burgundy dress of expensive material, her face partially concealed by a veil attached to her hat. Despite this, I could see that her complexion was pale, her eyes reddened as though from recent tears. In her gloved right hand she clutched a small wooden box with brass fittings. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "I apologize for calling so late without an appointment. I am desperate for your help." Holmes gestured towards the client's chair. "Please, Miss Thornfield, be seated. You have travelled from Kensington today, Have you not?" The lady started, lifting her veil as she took the offered seat. "How did you know?" "There is a particular quality of clay that adheres to footwear in that district, traces of which are visible on the hem of your dress." Holmes replied matter-of-factly, "Now pray tell us what brings you to Baker Street on such an inclement evening, and what connection it might have to the object you're carrying." Miss Thornfield glanced down at the box in her hands, as though she had forgotten she held it. "This," she said, placing it carefully on the table between us, "contains the remains of a clock that has been in my family for generations. Until yesterday, it was whole and functioning perfectly. Now, it may be the only clue to my brother's disappearance and the death of our butler." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest as he studied both the box and our visitor. "Start from the beginning, if you please, Miss Thornfield. Leave out no detail, however insignificant it may seem." She drew a deep breath to steady herself. "My brother, Edward Thornfield, is the head of our family and manages our estate and business interests. 3 days ago, he received a letter that visibly disturbed him, though he refused to discuss its contents. Yesterday morning, he locked himself in his study with strict instructions not to be disturbed." "At what time was this?" Holmes interjected. "Shortly after breakfast, around 9 o'clock. Our butler, Hargreaves, brought him tea at 11, as was customary. Everything seemed normal then. But at 3 in the afternoon, we heard a terrible crash from the study, followed by silence. When Hargreaves went to investigate, the door was still locked. After receiving no response to his knocking, he forced the door open." Miss Thornfield paused, her hands trembling slightly. "The room was empty, Mr. Holmes. My brother had vanished, the large window was open despite the cold, and this family heirloom, an antique clock that had stood on the mantelpiece for decades, lay shattered on the floor." She opened the box to reveal fragments of ornate clockwork, pieces of dark wood and shards of glass. And Hargreaves?" Holmes prompted gently. "He was found dead this morning in the garden shed, apparently from heart failure. But I am convinced his death is connected to Edward's disappearance. Before he died, he managed to place these clock fragments in this box and hide it in a place only I would find." Her voice broke. "Mr. Holmes, my brother's life is in danger. Will you help me?" Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me before turning back to our visitor. His face had assumed that peculiar concentrated expression I knew so well, the look of a bloodhound catching a promising scent. "Indeed I will, Miss Thornfield," he said quietly. "The case presents several points of interest already. Watson, I believe we shall postpone our quiet evening by the fire. It seems we have work to do." The game, as my friend was so fond of saying, was afoot. Chapter 2. The peculiarities of Thornfield Manor the following morning found Holmes and myself in a first-class railway carriage bound for Kensington. Miss Thornfield had departed the previous evening with Holmes's firm assurance that we would call upon her at 11 o'clock. My friend had spent much of the night examining the fragments of the shattered clock, arranging and rearranging the pieces on our dining table with meticulous attention. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked as our train rattled through the London suburbs. He sat opposite me, his angular face framed by the window, the passing scenery reflected in his keen grey eyes. "It is a case of considerable potential, Watson. The clock itself presents several curious features, such as It was not merely broken in a fall, as Miss Thornfield believes. Certain components were removed with precision before it was smashed, specifically parts of the winding mechanism and something from behind the faceplate. His long fingers tapped thoughtfully against his knee. But more intriguing still is the timing of events. Why would Edward Thornfield disappear at precisely the moment his ancestral timepiece was destroyed? The journey was brief, and soon we found ourselves before the imposing facade of Thornfield Manor. It was a substantial Victorian residence set back from the road, surrounded by high walls and an iron gate. The gardens, though well tended, bore the melancholy aspect common to London properties in late autumn. Miss Thornfield received us in a spacious drawing-room, adorned with the trappings of considerable wealth. Persian carpets, oil paintings in gilded frames, and furniture of the finest mahogany. She appeared more composed than during her visit to Baker Street, though the strain of her brother's disappearance remained evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Thank you for coming so promptly, Mr. Holmes," she said, gesturing for us to be seated. "Have you discovered anything from examining the clock?" "Several points of interest," Holmes replied, "but I require more information before drawing conclusions. I should like to see your brother's study exactly as it was found, and afterwards speak with any servants who might have observed anything unusual on the day of his disappearance." Miss Thornfield nodded. "Of course. The study remains untouched, save for the removal of poor Hargreaves' body from the grounds. I've instructed the staff to cooperate fully with your inquiries." She led us down a corridor lined with ancestral portraits, stern-faced gentlemen and elegant ladies whose eyes seemed to follow our progress. The study door stood at the far end, heavy oak now marred by splintering around the lock where it had been forced open. "This is where Hargreaves found the room empty," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Holmes pushed the door open and stepped inside, with myself and Miss Thornfield following. It was a handsome, scholarly room with walls lined by bookshelves and a large desk positioned before the window. The curtains were drawn back, revealing a view of the gardens, and beyond them the wall that enclosed the property. A marble fireplace dominated one wall, and above it a conspicuous empty space where, I presumed, the clock had once stood. Holmes moved immediately to this spot, examining the mantelpiece with his pocket magnifying glass. The clock stood here for many years. The slight discoloration of the marble indicates as much, he murmured. He turned his attention to the floor, where a faint dark stain spread across the Turkish carpet. "Blood? Yes," Miss Thornfield confirmed. "Hargreaves cut his hand when gathering the clock fragments." Holmes hummed thoughtfully, circling the room with the deliberate pace of a predator. He examined the window, tested its latch, then knelt to study the sill. "Tell me about this window, Miss Thornfield. Was it your brother's habit to leave it open?" "Never in such weather," she replied. "Edward was very particular about the temperature of the room, especially where his books were concerned, and yet it was found open after his disappearance." Holmes ran his finger along the frame. "Interesting. The rain from yesterday has left traces on the outside sill, but none within the room. The window was opened after the rain had ceased." He turned his attention to the desk, carefully sifting through the papers that lay scattered across its surface. Most appeared to be business correspondence, but Holmes quickly identified what he was seeking. "This would be the letter that disturbed your brother." He held up a sheet of paper that had been partially concealed beneath a ledger. Miss Thornfield moved closer. I believe so, though I haven't seen its contents. Holmes scanned the letter, his expression inscrutable. Postmarked from Dorset 3 days ago. Unsigned but written on expensive stationery with a distinctive watermark. He passed it to me. What do you make of the handwriting, Watson? I examined the letter closely. The message was brief, written in a flowing, educated hand. The past cannot remain buried forever. Time reveals all secrets. Be prepared to account for your actions of October 1881. The clock is ticking. A threat, clearly, I observed, and the reference to a clock seems significant, given what happened to the family heirloom. Precisely, Holmes replied, turning back to Miss Thornfield. What happened in October 1881 that might concern your brother? She shook her head, her brow furrowed. Nothing that I can recall. Edward would have been 24 then, newly returned from university. Our father was still alive, and Edward was learning to manage the family businesses. Holmes nodded, pocketing the letter. Now, I should like to see where Hargreaves was found. Miss Thornfield led us through the house and into the gardens. The rain had ceased, but the ground remained sodden, our footsteps leaving deep impressions in the grass. The garden shed stood at the property's edge, a stone structure partially covered in ivy. Its interior was dim and smelled of damp earth and rusted tools. He was discovered here by the gardener, slumped against that workbench, Miss Thornfield explained, her voice trembling slightly. Holmes examined the spot indicated, then the shed's contents, paying particular attention to his worn leather glove and a small brass key lying on the workbench. Was Hargreaves wearing gloves when found? He asked. Only on his left hand, she replied. The police thought nothing of it. The police, Holmes muttered with familiar disdain. See, but do not observe. He pocketed the key before continuing, his inspection finally emerging from the shed with a thoughtful expression. Miss Thornfield, he said as we walked back toward the house, I require one more piece of information. Who stands to inherit your brother's estate in the event of his death? She stopped abruptly, her face paling. Why, I suppose I do. We have no other immediate family. But surely you don't think— I think nothing yet, Holmes interrupted gently. I merely gather facts. Now, if you would be so kind as to introduce me to the household staff, particularly anyone who had regular contact with your brother. As we re-entered the house, I caught Holmes's eye and recognized the familiar gleam that signalled his mind was racing along paths invisible to ordinary observers. Whatever the truth behind Edward Thornfield's disappearance and the shattered clock, Sherlock Holmes was already several steps closer to unravelling it than anyone else. Chapter 3. Whispers. Among the Servants. The staff of Thornfield Manor assembled in the servants' hall at Holmes's request, a solemn gathering of housemaids, footmen, a cook, and gardener. They stood in a nervous semicircle, exchanging furtive glances, as Miss Thornfield introduced us. Holmes surveyed them with keen interest, his hawk-like gaze noting every detail of their appearance and demeanour. I thank you all for your cooperation, he began. I understand this is a difficult time for the household. I require information about Mr. Edward Thornfield's activities in the days before his disappearance, particularly any unusual occurrences or visitors. For a moment, silence reigned. Then a young housemaid stepped forward, twisting her apron between nervous fingers. "There was a gentleman, sir," she said hesitantly. "He came 3 times last week, always after dark. Mr. Thornfield would receive him in the study, and they would speak in low voices." "Did you observe this visitor's appearance?" Holmes asked. "Tall, sir, with a silver-topped walking stick. He wore a heavy coat with a fur collar and kept his hat low over his face. I never saw him proper-like." Holmes nodded encouragingly. "And these meetings, did they appear amicable?" The maid glanced at Miss Thornfield before answering. "Not at the last one, sir. There was shouting. I heard Mr. Thornfield say something about refusing to be blackmailed." Miss Thornfield gasped softly beside me. "I had no knowledge of these visits," she murmured. "Few things remain secret from observant household staff," Holmes remarked. "Was there anything else unusual in your master's behaviour recently?" An elderly man with stooped shoulders and gardener's calloused hands spoke up. "He took to walking the grounds at night, sir. I'd see him from my cottage, pacing by the old well near the north wall. He seemed troubled talking to himself." "And you, as gardener, did you work closely with Hargreaves?" Holmes inquired. "Aye, sir. We'd share a pipe sometimes in the evening. Hargreaves was worried about the master, said he'd been acting strangely since receiving that letter." "Did he mention any specifics about this strange behaviour?" The gardener scratched his grizzled chin. "Just that Mr. Thornfield had taken the clock from the mantelpiece twice to examine it, which was unusual. Always forbade anyone else to touch it, he did." Holmes's eyes brightened with interest. "When you found Hargreaves in the shed, what precisely was his position?" "Slumped against the workbench, sir. His right hand was clenched around something, but empty when I opened it. Thought it strange at the time." "Most observant," Holmes said approvingly. "One final question. Has anyone noticed anything missing from the house besides Mr. Thornfield himself?" The cook, a rotund woman with florid cheeks, cleared her throat. "The master's old travelling case is gone from the attic, sir. I noticed when fetching preserved fruits yesterday." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. "Thank you all for your candour. Should any of you recall additional details, however trivial they may seem, please inform Miss Thornfield immediately." As the servants filed out, Holmes turned to Miss Thornfield. "Now, I should like to examine the grounds, particularly the well your gardener mentioned." We followed a winding path through frost-tinged gardens until we reached a stone well, its ancient structure partially obscured by climbing ivy. Holmes circled it slowly, his eyes trained on the ground. "Ah, Watson, observe these footprints," he murmured, indicating faint impressions in the muddy earth. "A man's, size 11, expensive leather boots. The depth suggests someone of Edward. Thornfield's approximate weight." He knelt suddenly, extracting something from the base of the well with his penknife. A small piece of paper, sodden and partially decomposed. With delicate precision, he unfolded it to reveal a fragment of what appeared to be a map or diagram. "Most illuminating," he remarked, carefully preserving the fragment in his pocketbook. "And now, I believe we should inspect the attic where the travelling case was stored." The attic was a cathedral of forgotten treasures, furniture draped in dust sheets, trunks containing outdated finery, and shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers. Holmes made directly for a vacant space on one shelf, where the outline of a rectangular object was clearly visible in the dust. "The missing travelling case," he confirmed. "See how the dust has been disturbed recently, within the last 2 days, I should say." He began methodically examining the surrounding items, his attention soon captured by a stack of ledgers. "Business records," he murmured, flipping through one. "Dating back to 1880. Most interesting." "Have you found something significant?" I asked. "Perhaps," was his cryptic reply. He selected a ledger marked 1881 to 1882 and tucked it under his arm. "Miss Thornfield, I require one further piece of information. Is there a timepiece of any kind in this house that might have belonged to your father?" She appeared startled by the question. "Yes, his pocket watch. Edward keeps it in his bedroom as a memento." "I should like to see it, if possible, in Edward Thornfield's bedroom, a masculine sanctuary of dark wood and burgundy draperies. Miss Thornfield retrieved a gold pocket watch from a drawer in the bedside table. Holmes accepted it with reverent hands, examining it closely before opening the case. "Just as I suspected," he murmured, showing me the inscription inside. "To George Thornfield, with eternal gratitude, October 12th, 1881. Does this date hold significance?" Miss Thornfield asked. "Most certainly," Holmes replied, snapping the watch closed. "It coincides precisely with the threat in the letter your brother received." He paced the room briefly, his mind clearly racing through possibilities, before turning to our client with sudden decisiveness. "Miss Thornfield, I believe I have gathered sufficient information for the moment. There are inquiries I must make in London, records to consult." "But my brother is almost certainly alive," Holmes interjected. "The evidence suggests he left of his own accord, though perhaps under duress. I strongly advise you to remain here and continue as though nothing unusual has occurred. Should the mysterious visitor return, make no mention of our investigation." As we descended the grand staircase, Miss Thornfield following anxiously, Holmes added, "I shall telegraph you should I discover anything of immediate concern. Otherwise, expect us tomorrow afternoon." Outside, as we waited for the hansom cab, Holmes had summoned. I could contain my curiosity no longer. "You've formed a theory already, haven't you, Holmes?" An enigmatic smile played across his lips. "Several, Watson, but I require more data before committing to any one explanation. The case presents several fascinating aspects. The clock, the threat from the past, the butler's peculiar death. They are connected by a thread invisible to most, but I begin to discern its pattern." As our cab rattled back toward London, Holmes fell into one of his characteristic silences, staring out at the passing landscape with unfocused eyes that suggested his mind was racing along tracks far removed from the present moment. I knew better than to interrupt his contemplation, and instead found myself pondering the curious connection between a shattered clock, a decades-old pocket watch, and whatever secret lay buried in October of 1881. Chapter 4. Shadows from the Past Door. Return to Baker Street was conducted largely in silence, though I could see the wheels of Holmes's formidable intellect turning behind his contemplative gaze. Once ensconced in our lodgings, he immediately spread the fragments of the shattered clock across our dining table, alongside the business ledger he had appropriated from Thornfield Manor. "Watson," he said suddenly, breaking his prolonged silence, "what is your medical opinion on the butler's death?" "Heart failure," the authorities concluded. I considered the question carefully. Without examining the body, I can only speculate. Heart failure is certainly plausible for a man of his age, particularly if he discovered something shocking. However, Holmes interjected, the circumstances are decidedly suspicious. The timing, the missing glove, the clenched hand found empty. No, I think we can safely conclude that Hargreaves' demise was not entirely natural. He reached for his pipe, filling it with his favoured shag tobacco. The question that interests me is why the butler gathered these clock fragments and concealed them. What did he see in them that was worth preserving? Perhaps worth dying for? Holmes spent the next hour meticulously examining each piece of the broken timepiece, occasionally referring to a horological reference book. Meanwhile, I perused the ledger, finding it filled with mundane business transactions recorded in a precise hand. Anything of interest in the family finances? Holmes asked without looking up from his work. Nothing immediately apparent, I replied. The Thornfield shipping business seems to have been quite profitable during this period. There are regular payments to various suppliers, wages, maintenance costs for vessels. Check October 1881, specifically, Holmes suggested, selecting a particular fragment of the clock mechanism and examining it under his magnifying glass. I turned to the relevant pages and scanned the entries. Here's something curious. On October 10th, there's an entry for £5,000 marked simply as Special Investment. It's followed by another entry on the 12th for £3,000 labelled Compensation GT Personal. GT, George Thornfield, Holmes mused, the father, and the very date inscribed in his pocket watch. Most suggestive. He rose abruptly, moving to the cluttered desk where he withdrew a collection of newspaper clippings. While you were engaged with the ledger, I've been refreshing my memory regarding shipping incidents from that period. The early 1880s were notable for several maritime disasters, including... He selected a particular clipping. Ah, yes, the sinking of the merchant vessel Star of Bengal off the Dorset coast on October 9th, 1881. Dorset, I echoed. The threatening letter came from there. Precisely, Watson. The ship was owned by the Thornfield Shipping Company and went down, in mysterious circumstances, with considerable loss of life. The official inquiry concluded it was an unfortunate accident resulting from unseaworthy conditions, though the vessel had recently passed inspection. Holmes paced the room, the smoke from his pipe creating a nimbus around his angular profile. The coincidence of dates is striking. The ship sinks on the 9th, a special investment is recorded on the 10th, and a compensation payment follows on the 12th, the same day George Thornfield received his inscribed pocket watch in gratitude. You suspect foul play regarding the shipwreck. I suspect a conspiracy of silence, Watson, one that has lain dormant for decades, until something or someone disturbed it. Holmes returned to the fragments of the clock. This timepiece is the key. It's of Swiss manufacture, approximately 60 years old. Observe the craftsmanship of the internal mechanism, particularly this section. He held up a small brass component, marked with minute engravings. These markings are not ornamental. They are a form of code or perhaps a maker's signature. Most intriguing. At that moment, our discussion was interrupted by a sharp knock at our door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram addressed to Holmes, who tore it open with unusual eagerness. From my contact at Lloyd's of London. he explained as he read. "I requested information about the insurance claim filed for the Star of Bengal." His eyes darted across the page, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. As I suspected, the ship was insured for twice its actual value just 1 month before it sank. The claim was initially contested, but ultimately paid in full after the intervention of an independent maritime assessor who verified the valuation. And this assessor was a Mr. James Harrow of Dorchester, Dorset. Holmes folded the telegram carefully. "A name worth investigating, I think." He resumed his examination of the clock fragments, working with methodical precision, until, quite suddenly, he gave a triumphant exclamation. "Watson, look here!" From within the damaged mechanism, Holmes extracted a small folded piece of yellowed paper that had been concealed in a hollow behind the clock face. With delicate fingers, he unfolded it to reveal what appeared to be a ship's manifest, dated October 7th, 1881, the Star of Bengal's final cargo manifest. Holmes breathed, his eyes scanning the document, and quite different from the official version submitted to the insurance company. The ship wasn't carrying cotton and manufactured goods as claimed. It was transporting a much less valuable cargo of stone ballast and empty crates. Insurance fraud, I concluded. On a grand scale, Holmes agreed. But that alone doesn't explain the current situation. There's more to this mystery. He studied the manifest again. The captain's signature here, Bartholomew Mercer. I wonder what became of him. Holmes moved to his reference indexes, flipping through several volumes before finding what he sought. Captain Bartholomew Mercer, presumed drowned with his ship in 1881. However, here's a curious note. An unconfirmed sighting of a man resembling Mercer in Australia in 1885, though officially he perished with his vessel. He closed the book with a snap. I believe it's time we consulted another source. Watson, are you prepared for an excursion to the docks? Within the hour, we found ourselves in a smoky tavern near the Thames where retired sailors gathered to exchange tales of their seafaring days. Holmes, having adopted the slight stoop and weathered appearance of a ship's quartermaster, moved among them with practised ease, buying rounds of grog and listening to stories of vessels long lost to the depths. It was nearly dusk when he extracted, himself, from a particularly garrulous group of old mariners, and rejoined me at our corner table, his eyes gleaming with suppressed excitement. "The pieces begin to fit together," he murmured, leaning close to avoid being overheard. The Star of Bengal was, indeed, deliberately scuttled, but not all hands were lost, as officially reported. Several crewmen survived, those who were part of the conspiracy. The ship was emptied of its fictional valuable cargo before being sunk in a storm to conceal the evidence. And Captain Mercer reportedly fled to Australia with his share of the insurance money, after a brief sojourn in Dorset, where, I strongly suspect, he encountered one George Thornfield. Holmes glanced at his pocket watch. "We have one more call to make before returning to Baker Street. The offices of Lloyd's should still be open, and I wish to examine the original insurance claim more closely." As we stepped back onto the foggy London street, I sensed that Holmes was closing in on the truth behind Edward Thornfield's disappearance and the shattered clock. A truth that had remained concealed for over 40 years, but was now, like time itself, inexorably ticking toward revelation. Chapter 5. The Spider's Web. The offices of Lloyd's were nearly deserted when we arrived, save for a few clerks finalising the day's business. Holmes had telegraphed ahead to his contact, a Mr. Percival Jennings, who greeted us with the harried air of a man with little time to spare. "Mr. Holmes," he said, ushering us into a small office lined with filing cabinets, "I've located the records you requested, though I must emphasize the irregular nature of this access." "Your discretion is appreciated and will be noted," Holmes assured him. "We require only a brief examination." Jennings produced a substantial folder, yellowed with age, the complete file on the Star of Bengal claim. Most unusual case, still referenced in training as an example of complex settlement negotiations. Holmes opened the file with careful fingers, his keen eyes scanning the documents within. "The Irish Maritime Assessor's Report," he murmured, extracting several pages. "Signed by James Harrow of Dorchester. Interesting that his assessment superseded the initial valuation." "That was the unusual aspect," Jennings confirmed. "Harrow's reputation was impeccable, which is why his intervention carried such weight. His report convinced the underwriters to pay the claim despite initial suspicions." "And this Harrow, did he handle other assessments for Thornfield Shipping?" "No," Jennings replied, consulting another document. "This appears to have been his only involvement with the company. Shortly afterward, he relocated to South Africa, citing health concerns." "South Africa," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "A convenient distance from potential scrutiny." As he continued examining the file, Holmes paused at a particular document, his expression sharpening. "The list of lost crew members. 27 souls officially perished, including Captain Mercer. Yet the ship's previous manifest indicated a standard crew of 35. "Perhaps not all crew members were aboard for that voyage," I suggested. "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, "or perhaps some were never intended to be found." He pointed to a notation at the bottom of the page. "The recovery of bodies was hampered by severe weather conditions, according to this report. Only 9 were ever found." He flipped to another document, a detailed diagram of the ship with annotations indicating where the purported valuable cargo had been stored. The vessel sank in relatively shallow waters, yet no salvage operation was attempted. Most curious, the location was deemed too hazardous, Jennings explained. "Treacherous currents, rocky seabed. Or perhaps," Holmes suggested, "salvage might have revealed inconvenient truths." After making several notes in his pocketbook, Holmes returned the files to Jennings with thanks. Outside, as we hailed a hansom cab, I observed that his features had assumed that peculiar focused expression that signalled his mind was rapidly assembling the pieces of the puzzle. "We have one more visit to make before returning to Baker Street," he announced. "The offices of the Times newspaper. Their archives may contain information that hasn't made its way into my own files." The newspaper's archives were housed in a basement room filled with bound volumes arranged chronologically. The archivist, clearly impressed by Holmes's reputation, provided us with the volumes covering September through November 1881. "I require reports on the Star of Bengal disaster," Holmes explained, "but also any mention of the Thornfield family or James Harrow during this period." We divided the volumes between us, scanning the densely printed pages by lamplight. After nearly an hour of silent research, I came across a small article that caught my attention. "Holmes, listen to this," I said, reading aloud. October 14th, 1881, Mr. George Thornfield, the prominent shipping magnate, has announced a generous donation of $2,000 to the families of those lost in the recent Star of Bengal tragedy. Mr. Thornfield expressed profound regret at the loss of life, and pledged that safety measures across his fleet would be enhanced forthwith. Philanthropy or conscience money? Holmes mused. Continue searching, Watson. Several minutes later, Holmes gave a soft exclamation of triumph. Well, here we have it, a small notice from October 20th. The newly established Mercer Memorial Fund for Seafarers' Families acknowledges a substantial anonymous contribution. The fund, named in honour of the late Captain Bartholomew Mercer, will provide ongoing support to dependents of those lost at sea. Another convenient way to distribute compensation, I remarked. Indeed, Holmes agreed. And note the timing. Less than 2 weeks after the disaster. Most efficient for a charitable foundation to be established so quickly. He continued searching until he found one more relevant item. November the 2nd, Mr. James Harrow, the respected maritime assessor, departs for Cape Town, where he intends to establish a new practice. Mr. Harrow cites the favourable climate as beneficial for his respiratory condition. Holmes closed the volume with a satisfied expression. 3 participants in the drama, all making significant moves within weeks of the incident. George Thornfield remains in London, enhanced by insurance proceeds, and bearing a new watch given in eternal gratitude. James Harrow relocates to South Africa, with, one might reasonably surmise, a handsome payment for his services. And Captain Mercer, officially deceased, has a memorial fund established in his name, a perfect vehicle for receiving ongoing payments while presumed dead. A conspiracy indeed, I said. But how does this connect to Edward Thornfield's disappearance and the shattered clock? Patience, Watson, Holmes replied, rising from the table. Let us return to Baker Street, where I have one more experiment to conduct with the fragments of our broken timepiece. Night had fallen by the time we arrived back at our lodgings. Holmes immediately resumed his examination of the clock fragments, this time paying particular attention to the wooden case rather than the mechanism. The wood itself may hold answers, he explained, applying a solution from one of his chemical vials to the inner surface of a larger fragment. Under the influence of the reagent, faint markings began to appear, letters and numbers that had been invisible to the naked eye. Sympathetic ink, Holmes breathed, activated by the application of heat. He hurriedly prepared a stronger solution and applied it to the remaining wooden fragments, revealing a series of notations that, when arranged correctly, formed what appeared to be geographical coordinates. Latitude and longitude, Holmes confirmed, consulting a maritime atlas. A location off the Dorset coast, the exact spot where the Star of Bengal went down. He sat back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of intellectual conquest. Now, I understand the true significance of the clock. It was never merely a family heirloom. It was a safe deposit box, containing both the evidence of the insurance fraud and the location where the real value lies. What real value? I asked, confused. Think, Watson. If the ship wasn't carrying the declared cargo, what might it have been carrying instead? Something valuable enough to justify an elaborate fraud, yet compact enough to be secretly offloaded before the sinking. Something worth killing for, even decades later. Before I could respond, the sharp ring of our doorbell interrupted the conversation. Mrs. Hudson appeared moments later with a telegram addressed to Holmes, who tore it open with uncharacteristic haste. "From Miss Thornfield," he announced, his expression grave. "The mysterious visitor has returned, demanding to see Edward. She fears for her safety and has locked herself in her bedroom." He checked his pocket watch. The telegram was sent over an hour ago. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "We must return to Thornfield Manor immediately. The game is advancing more rapidly than I anticipated, and Miss Thornfield may be in genuine danger." As we rushed down the stairs, I glimpsed Holmes slipping his revolver into his pocket, a clear indication that he expected trouble. Whatever secrets lay behind the shattered clock, they had already led to one death, and Holmes was determined to prevent another. Chapter 6. Return to Thornfield Manor. Our journey back to Kensington was conducted with the utmost urgency, though the late hour and foggy conditions slowed our progress. Holmes sat rigid beside me in the hansom cab, his fingers drumming impatiently as London's gaslit streets slid past our windows. "I fear we may be too late," he muttered, checking his pocket watch again. "The timing suggests our adversary has accelerated his plans." "You believe Miss Thornfield is in immediate danger?" I asked, ensuring my service revolver was accessible. "She represents both an obstacle and a potential source of information," Holmes replied. "If our visitor cannot locate Edward Thornfield or what he seeks, he may resort to more direct methods of persuasion." As we approached Thornfield Manor, Holmes suddenly tensed. "Watson, observe the upper floor, the third window from the left. Through the fog, I discerned a faint flickering light moving behind the curtains. Someone with a lamp, I noted. That is Edward Thornfield's study, which should be unoccupied," Holmes said grimly. We stopped some distance from the house and proceeded on foot across the grounds, avoiding the gravel drive. The manor loomed before us, most windows dark save for the light we had observed. We entered through an unlocked side door and made our way silently towards the main staircase. The distinct creak of floorboards overhead stopped us momentarily before. Holmes gestured for me to follow him up the stairs, staying close to the wall to avoid detection. In the upstairs corridor, Holmes pointed toward Edward Thornfield's study, where a thin line of light was visible beneath the door. We positioned ourselves on either side of the doorway, and Holmes suddenly flung it open, levelling his weapon at the room's occupant. "Do not move," he commanded. The man at the desk looked up sharply, tall, weathered, with cold, calculating eyes that showed more annoyance than fear. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," he said, his voice carrying a colonial accent. "Your reputation for inconvenient timing is well deserved." "And you," Holmes replied, "would be Captain Bartholomew Mercer, late of the ill-fated Star of Bengal, a vessel you deliberately scuttled in 1881 as part of an insurance fraud." The man made no attempt to deny it. "You're well informed, though I now go by Harrison Blake, safer when conducting business in England." "The business of blackmail and burglary," Holmes observed. "What exactly are you seeking, Captain?" Blake smiled humorlessly. "Where is Edward Thornfield?" "That is precisely what we came to ascertain," Holmes replied, "though I suspect you know more than you admit." A flicker of genuine confusion crossed Blake's features. If I knew where that coward was hiding, I wouldn't be ransacking his study at midnight." Holmes studied him intently. "What transpired during your last meeting?" "I merely reminded him of his father's obligations," Blake said smoothly. "George Thornfield made certain promises that his son has failed to honour. Promises regarding the real cargo of the Star of Bengal," Holmes suggested. "Something valuable enough to justify decades of silence." Before Blake could respond, Miss Thornfield burst into the room, clutching a telegram. She stopped short at the scene before her. "Dr. Watson, thank heaven you've come. She broke off as Holmes emerged from behind the door. "Miss Thornfield," he said gently, "I see you received our message." "Yes, but—" Her eyes darted to Blake. "Who is this man?" "Captain Mercer, or Mr. Blake, as he now styles himself. An old associate of your father's," Holmes explained. Blake assessed Miss Thornfield coldly. "Your brother understands precisely what I seek. The agreement was clear. 40 years of silence in exchange for regular payments. Your father honoured it until his death, after which Edward continued, until recently." Once we were seated, Holmes addressed Miss Thornfield. "Your father was involved in an insurance fraud concerning the Star of Bengal. The ship was deliberately sunk after its valuable cargo was secretly offloaded." He turned to Blake. "What exactly was the ship carrying, Captain?" "That information is worth a considerable sum," Blake replied impassively. "Worth killing for?" Holmes asked sharply. "Was Hargreaves' death your doing?" Blake appeared genuinely surprised. "The butler. I had nothing to do with that. I found him dead in the garden shed when I came looking for Edward 2 days ago." He was clutching something in his hand. Holmes pressed. "Something later removed." "When I found him, his hand was empty," Blake insisted, "though there was a ring of rust around his finger, as though he had been wearing some metal object exposed to moisture." Holmes's eyes lit with understanding. "The key, of course." He turned to Miss Thornfield. "Your brother is not in danger from Captain Blake, but may be in danger nonetheless. When did you last see him?" 2 days ago, before he locked himself in his study," she replied. "Your brother has gone to secure something of great value, connected to coordinates hidden within the family clock," Holmes explained, then fixed Blake with a penetrating stare. "Which is why you smashed it, I presume?" Blake's composure cracked. "I did no such thing. The clock was intact when I last spoke with Edward. He refused my terms and told me to return in 2 days." Comprehension dawned on his face. He must have decoded the location himself and departed to claim the treasure before I could intervene. "What treasure?" Miss Thornfield and I asked simultaneously. Holmes raised his hand for silence, his gaze never leaving Blake. "Tell us about the Star of Bengal's true cargo, Captain, and perhaps we can reach an accommodation that serves all parties." As Blake hesitated, weighing his options, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the depths of Thornfield Manor, a door slammed with ominous finality. Chapter 7. The Revelation of the Timepiece. Holmes was on his feet instantly, revolver raised. "Watson, the door!" he commanded in a low voice. I moved swiftly to position myself beside the entrance, my own weapon at the ready. Miss Thornfield clutched at the arms of her chair, her eyes wide with fear. What was that? "Someone else is in the house," Holmes replied, keeping his gaze fixed on Blake, who remained seated but had tensed visibly. Someone who knows the layout well enough to move in darkness. The servants, Miss Thornfield began, would announce themselves. Holmes finished. No, this is someone who desires secrecy. He addressed Blake sharply. Did you come alone tonight, Captain? Blake's expression hardened. I work alone, Mr. Holmes. Always have. Holmes studied him for a moment, then seemed to accept his statement. Miss Thornfield, where would someone enter the house unobserved? A servant's entrance, perhaps. There's the kitchen door at the rear, and an old delivery entrance near the east wing, she replied, her voice steadier now. Both should be locked at this hour, and yet our visitor has managed to gain entry. Holmes mused. Watson, remain here with Miss Thornfield and our guest. I shall investigate. Holmes, I strongly advise, I began, but he cut me off with a gesture. 3 minutes, Watson. If I haven't returned, use your best judgment. With that, he slipped out into the corridor, moving as silently as a shadow. The atmosphere in the study grew tense as we awaited Holmes's return. Blake sat motionless, his cold eyes darting occasionally toward the door. Miss Thornfield perched anxiously on the edge of her chair, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her dress. Mr. Blake, I said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, you mentioned an agreement with George Thornfield. What precisely were the terms? He gave me a measuring look before responding. Simple enough, Doctor. In exchange for my silence regarding certain irregularities in the Star of Bengal affair, I received quarterly payments. A mutually beneficial arrangement, and recently Edward Thornfield stopped these payments, I suggested. 2 months ago, Blake confirmed, with no explanation. When I pressed him for answers, he became evasive, then hostile. Most unlike his father, who always understood the value of discretion. Before I could inquire further, the door opened and Holmes re-entered, his expression grave. The house appears secure, but someone has been in the kitchen. A cabinet was left open, and fresh mud tracks lead to and from the garden door. One of the servants, perhaps, Miss Thornfield suggested hopefully. The footprints belong to a man wearing expensive leather boots, approximately size 10, Holmes replied. Too large for your footman, and the tread pattern matches those we observed earlier by the well, Edward Thornfield's boots. Edward? Miss Thornfield gasped. He's here. Was here briefly, Holmes corrected. I suspect he returned to retrieve something vital to his plans. He turned to Blake. Now, Captain, the time for half-truths has passed. What precisely was the Star of Bengal carrying that remains valuable enough to warrant 40 years of blackmail? Payments? Blake's jaw worked for a moment, calculating his options. Finally, he sighed. Diamonds, Mr. Holmes. Industrial diamonds primarily, but also a selection of fine gemstones. They were being transported secretly for a consortium of South African mining interests who wished to circumvent certain export restrictions. An illicit shipment, then, Holmes noted, and one with considerable value. £3 million at current valuation, Blake confirmed. George Thornfield arranged for the diamonds to be offloaded at a secluded cove near Lyme Regis before the ship continued its journey to its doom. And the diamonds? Holmes pressed, buried on George Thornfield's insistence. He considered it too dangerous to attempt to sell them immediately. The plan was to wait several years, then gradually introduce small quantities into the market. The exact location was known only to him, encoded somehow in that blasted clock. Holmes nodded, as though Blake had merely confirmed his suspicions. A prudent approach, and for 40 years you were content with your regular stipend until recently. What changed, Captain? I'm not getting any younger, Mr. Holmes. Blake replied bluntly. I decided it was time to collect the principal, as it were. With the original conspirators dead or scattered, the risk seemed minimal. All except Edward Thornfield, who inherited both his father's secret and his obligation to you, Holmes observed. Precisely. When I informed him of my desire to conclude our arrangement, he became difficult. Blake's expression darkened. He claimed his father had taken the location to his grave, that the payments were merely to maintain family honour. I didn't believe him then, and I certainly don't believe him now. Holmes turned to Miss Thornfield, who had been listening with increasing distress. Your brother discovered the coordinates hidden in the clock. The question is, why destroy the timepiece afterward? To prevent Blake from finding the same information, I suggested. Perhaps, Holmes acknowledged, though that seems an excessive measure when simply removing the clock would have sufficed. His brow furrowed in thought. No, there must be another explanation. He paced the room, hands clasped behind his back, then suddenly stopped. The key found in the garden shed, the one Hargreaves had been holding. Miss Thornfield, might I see it? She blinked in surprise. I don't have it. I assumed you had taken it. I did not, Holmes replied, his expression sharpening. Watson, did you observe what became of that key? You pocketed it during our inspection of the shed, I recalled. Holmes quickly searched his pockets, his movements becoming more agitated. It's gone, he declared finally. Taken from my pocket, most likely during our investigations in London. By whom? I asked, astonished. By someone who has been monitoring our progress closely, Holmes replied grimly. Someone who knows precisely what we've discovered and what we have yet to learn. Blake leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. What key is this? What does it open? That, said Holmes, is what we must determine. He turned to Miss Thornfield. Your brother's travelling case that was taken from the attic. Can you describe it? It's an old leather case with brass fittings, she replied. Rather worn, with E.T. stamped on the lid. My father gave it to Edward for his 21st birthday. And did it have a lock? Yes, a small brass lock. Edward always kept the key on his watch chain. Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. Not his watch chain, his father's. The pocket watch was not merely a memento, it concealed the key to the case. He spun to face Blake. You never found the diamonds because they were never buried as you believed. George Thornfield was too shrewd for that. He kept them close, hidden within a secret compartment in the clock itself. Impossible, Blake scoffed. I examined that clock thoroughly during my previous visits. Examined, but did not dismantle, Holmes countered. The mechanism contained a hidden chamber, accessible only with the specific key, the key Hargreaves found and died protecting. When Edward realized you were closing in, he removed the diamonds, destroyed the clock to eliminate evidence of the compartment, and fled with his inheritance. Miss Thornfield's hand flew to her mouth. Then Edward is in grave danger, Holmes finished. The coordinates in the clock were a misdirection. a false trail created by your father to divert attention from the true hiding place. But someone else has deduced the truth. Someone who has been manipulating events from the shadows. The sudden, sharp report of a pistol shot from somewhere outside the house cut through the night, followed by a second report in quick succession. Holmes was at the window instantly, peering into the darkness. "There," he said urgently, pointing toward the garden. "A figure running toward the north wall. Watson, quickly!" As we raced from the room and down the stairs, Miss Thornfield called after us, "What about Blake?" "Bring him!" Holmes shouted back. "We may need him yet." Outside, the night air was crisp and cold, the garden silvered by moonlight. Holmes led us toward the old well, his keen eyes scanning the grounds for any movement. As we approached, a dark shape became visible. A man's body sprawled face down on the damp earth. Holmes knelt beside the figure, gently turning him over to reveal the pale, bloodless face of Edward Thornfield. Chapter 8. A Race Against Shadows. "He's alive," Holmes announced after examining Edward Thornfield's still form. "Though barely. Watson, your medical expertise is required urgently." I knelt beside the wounded man, quickly identifying a bullet wound in his left shoulder. The injury, while serious, had fortunately missed any vital organs. Blood had soaked through his jacket and waistcoat, pooling darkly on the damp ground beneath him. "We must get him inside immediately," I declared, already removing my scarf to create a temporary pressure bandage. "He's lost considerable blood, but with proper care he should survive." As we carefully lifted Edward Thornfield between us, I caught sight of something clutched in his right hand, a small leather pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. Holmes noticed it simultaneously, and deftly secured it in his own pocket without comment. Miss Thornfield had followed us, with Blake trailing behind under the watchful eye of my revolver that Holmes had insisted she carry. Upon seeing her wounded, "Brother?" She let out a cry of distress, but quickly composed herself. "My brother's bedroom, it's closest," she directed, leading the way back to the house. We transported the unconscious man with as much care as possible, laying him on his bed while Miss Thornfield hurried to fetch hot water and clean linens. Blake lingered in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he observed the scene. "Whoever shot him couldn't have gone far," Holmes remarked, moving to the window to scan the grounds. Yet, in this darkness, pursuit would be futile without knowing which direction they fled. "You believe it wasn't Blake?" I asked quietly, as I cut away Edward Thornfield's blooded clothing to better access his wound. "Captain Blake was with us when the shots were fired," Holmes replied. "No, this is the work of our third player, the one who has been shadowing our investigation." I cleaned and bandaged the wound as best I could with the materials at hand. "He needs a surgeon, Holmes. The bullet is still lodged in his shoulder. I've sent a footman for Dr. Harrison," Miss Thornfield informed us as she returned with the requested supplies. "He lives but 10 minutes away." While we waited for the doctor's arrival, Holmes examined the room methodically, paying particular attention to Edward Thornfield's belongings. On the bedside table lay a pocket watch, not George Thornfield's inscribed timepiece, but Edward's own. Beside it sat a small notebook bound in worn leather. "Most revealing," Holmes murmured, flipping through the pages. "Coordinates, calculations, and a series of notations regarding tide schedules for the Dorset coast. He paused at a particular page. Here, a reference to father's deception and the false trail. Blake had edged closer, his interest evident. What does it say about the diamonds? Nothing explicit, Holmes replied, though there is mention of securing the legacy and the final resolution. He turned to another page. Ah, and here, a curious notation. HJM must be eliminated from the equation. HJM? I echoed, looking up from my patient. Harrison James Mercer, Blake supplied, his face paling slightly. My full name. It would appear, Holmes observed, that Edward Thornfield planned to end your arrangement permanently, Captain Blake. Before Blake could respond, we heard the arrival of Dr. Harrison, a portly, white-haired gentleman who entered the room with fear, the brisk efficiency of a medical man accustomed to emergencies. I briefed him on the patient's condition and assisted as he probed for and extracted the bullet with practiced skill. He'll recover, Dr. Harrison announced finally, applying fresh bandages. The bullet was small caliber and caused minimal damage. Blood loss is his primary concern at present. Rest and careful monitoring will be essential for the next 48 hours. As the doctor prepared to leave, Holmes drew him aside. One question, if you please. Have you treated Hargreaves, the butler of this household, recently? The doctor appeared momentarily surprised. Indeed, Mr. Holmes. He consulted me 3 weeks ago regarding chest pains. I diagnosed angina pectoris and advised him to avoid strenuous activity. A weak heart, unfortunately common in men his age. Most illuminating, Holmes murmured. Thank you, Doctor. Once Dr. Harrison had departed, Holmes pulled me into the corridor. We must act quickly, Watson. Our adversary clearly believes Edward. Thornfield succeeded in retrieving the diamonds and will not hesitate to strike again. But who is this mysterious third party? I asked. Someone intimately familiar with the original conspiracy, Holmes replied. Someone who, like Blake, has been waiting decades for an opportunity to claim the hidden fortune. He glanced back, toward the bedroom where Miss Thornfield sat beside her brother. We require a secure location for our discussions. The library, perhaps. The Thornfield Library was an imposing room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive oak table. Holmes guided Blake to a chair and sat opposite him, while I stood guard by the door, my revolver still at the ready. Now, Captain, Holmes began, it's time for complete candour. Who else knew about the diamonds? Who among your original conspirators remains alive? Blake hesitated, then sighed. James Harrow, the maritime assessor who authenticated the inflated insurance claim. As I told you, he relocated to South Africa after the affair. And returned recently, I presume? Holmes pressed. I've had no contact with Harrow in over 30 years, Blake insisted. Last I heard, he had established a successful practice in Cape Town. Holmes extracted the leather pouch from his pocket and emptied its contents onto the table. 5 uncut diamonds, each approximately the size of a small pebble, glittering coldly in the lamplight. These were in Edward Thornfield's possession when he was shot, Holmes explained. A small sample of the larger cash, I suspect, taken to verify their authenticity before completing his plan. Blake stared at the stones with naked greed. After all these years? Quite so, Holmes agreed. Now, I find it curious that Edward Thornfield, having successfully located and presumably secured the diamonds, would return to the house where you would inevitably come looking for him. It suggests either remarkable confidence or a secondary agenda. He tapped the notebook thoughtfully. This reference to elimination, was he planning to silence you permanently, Captain Blake? Before Blake could answer, a soft knock at the library door drew our attention. Miss Thornfield entered, her face drawn with fatigue but composed. "Edward is sleeping," she reported. "The doctor says he shows signs of improvement already." "Excellent news," Holmes replied. "Miss Thornfield, I must ask, did your brother ever mention a man named James Harrow to you?" She frowned slightly. "The name is vaguely familiar." "Yes, I recall Edward receiving correspondence from someone by that name several months ago. He seemed disturbed by it, though he wouldn't discuss the contents." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me. "The web grows clearer. Harrow contacted Edward, perhaps threatening to expose the insurance fraud independently if he wasn't given a share of the diamonds. This may have prompted Edward to locate the cash before either Harrow or Blake could claim it." "But who shot him?" Miss Thornfield asked, her voice trembling slightly. "That," said Holmes, rising to his feet, "is what we must discover immediately. The diamonds your brother retrieved are merely a fraction of the whole. The bulk of the treasure remains to be secured, and our mysterious assailant is doubtless already moving to claim it." He turned to Blake with sudden decisiveness. "Captain, I believe it's time we discussed an alliance. Your knowledge of the original conspiracy, combined with what we've learned about Edward Thornfield's plans, may be our only hope of preventing further bloodshed." As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 3 in the morning, the strange assembly in the Thornfield Library began formulating a plan to trap a killer and secure a fortune that had lain hidden for 40 years. A fortune that had already cost 2 lives and threatened more. Chapter 9. The timekeeper's cipher dawn broke over Thornfield Manor in a weak haze of autumn light, revealing a household that had scarcely slept. Holmes had spent the remaining hours of darkness poring over Edward Thornfield's notebook, occasionally making notations of his own, while Blake watched with barely concealed impatience. I divided my time between guarding our reluctant ally and checking on our patient, who remained unconscious but stable. Miss Thornfield had arranged a light breakfast in the morning room, though none of us had much appetite. The tension was palpable as Holmes finally closed the notebook and addressed us. "I believe I understand Edward Thornfield's strategy," he announced. "The coordinates hidden in the clock were indeed a misdirection, but they were also a key to a more elaborate cipher, one that could only be decoded with additional information from his father's pocket watch." "The inscription?" I suggested. "Not merely the inscription, Watson, but the watch itself." Holmes extracted George Thornfield's timepiece from his pocket. "Observe the unusual configuration of the numerals on the face. They appear standard at first glance, but several are subtly altered in their formation." He passed the watch to me, and upon close inspection, I noted that certain numbers did indeed feature minute variations. Lines extended or shortened by fractions of a millimetre. "A code?" Blake interjected, leaning forward with renewed interest. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. When combined with the coordinates from the clock, these variations translate to an entirely different location, one considerably closer to London than the Dorset coast. "Where?" Blake demanded. Holmes studied him carefully before responding. "I believe that information should remain between myself and Dr. Watson for the moment, Captain Blake. While our temporary alliance serves a common purpose, prudence suggests certain details should remain compartmentalized." Blake's weathered face darkened. "You don't trust me?" "I trust you to act in your own best interest," Holmes replied evenly, "which may not align perfectly with ours, particularly when £3 million in diamonds are concerned." Before Blake could protest further, the door opened to admit Miss Thornfield, her face brightening with relief. "Edward is awake," she announced. "Weak but lucid. He's asking for you, Mr. Holmes." We found Edward Thornfield propped against his pillows, pale and drawn, but clear-eyed. He was a man of perhaps 45, with features that reminded me strongly of his sister, though hardened by years of business concerns. His gaze sharpened as we entered, focusing immediately on Holmes. "So you are the famous detective," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "Eleanor told me you've been investigating my situation." "Indeed, Mr. Thornfield," Holmes replied, taking a seat beside the bed, "though your cooperation would greatly expedite matters. Who shot you?" A ghost of a smile touched Edward's lips. "Direct, aren't you?" "It was Harrow, James Harrow. He returned from Africa 3 months ago, making the same demands as Blake. When I refused him, he threatened to expose everything." His eyes flickered to the doorway where Blake stood watching. "I see you've met my father's other partner in crime." "Your father was many things, Thornfield, but he kept his word to me," Blake retorted. "Until he couldn't any longer," Edward replied, wearily. "Death has a way of ending arrangements." Holmes leaned forward. "The diamonds, Mr. Thornfield. You've retrieved them?" "Some," Edward admitted. "A small portion I took as proof they still existed, and the rest." Edward hesitated, glancing toward his sister. Safe, for now, hidden where neither Blake nor Harrow would think to look. "In plain sight, I suspect," Holmes observed. "Your father was cleverer than his conspirators anticipated. He never intended to bury a fortune offshore and leave it to the vagaries of tide and weather." Edward's eyes widened slightly. "You've deduced it already?" "The general principle, yes, though not the precise location." Holmes extracted the notebook from his pocket. "Your calculations regarding the false coordinates were most informative, as were your references to your father's deception. The clock was the key," Edward explained, "not just for the coordinates, but for understanding his methodology. Father was obsessed with time, its passage, its measurement. He used to say that the present exists only as a membrane between past and future." He paused, gathering strength. "When I realized Harrow had returned and was working with someone inside the household, I knew I had to act quickly." "Someone inside the household?" Miss Thornfield echoed, aghast. "Who?" Edward closed his eyes briefly. "Hargreaves." "The butler," I exclaimed. "But he's dead." "Yes," Edward confirmed. "When I confronted him about his communications with Harrow, he admitted everything. He'd been corresponding with Harrow for years, keeping him informed about our family affairs. But he claimed he'd had a change of heart, said he couldn't go through with betraying us in the end." He winced as he shifted position. He found the key to the hidden compartment in the clock and brought it to me, along with a warning that Harrow had arrived in England. That's when I decided to recover the diamonds before Harrow could reach them. "And Hargreaves's death?" Holmes prompted. "Heart failure, genuinely," Edward replied. "He collapsed in the garden shed after helping me secure the first cache of diamonds. The stress was too much for his weakened heart." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And after retrieving the bulk of the diamonds, you returned for some purpose, only to encounter Harrow waiting for you. I needed my father's ledger, the one with the complete inventory. Without it, there would always be uncertainty about whether all the diamonds had been recovered." Edward's gaze hardened. "Harrow ambushed me by the well. We struggled, and he shot me. I managed to escape into the gardens, but he pursued me. The second shot caught me in the shoulder, and Harrow fled when he heard us approaching," I concluded. "He won't have gone far," Holmes observed, "not without securing his prize, which means we have very little time." He fixed Edward with an intense gaze. "Mr. Thornfield, I need to know exactly where the diamonds are hidden. Harrow has already demonstrated his willingness to kill, and your sister may be in danger while he remains at large." Edward seemed to wage an internal struggle before finally relenting. "The family mausoleum in the cemetery at St. Michael's Church. My grandfather's sarcophagus has a false panel in the base. Father's macabre sense of humour, hiding ill-gotten wealth among the family dead." Holmes rose immediately. "Miss Thornfield, you will remain here with your brother. Watson and I will investigate the mausoleum. Captain Blake—" "I'm coming with you," Blake interrupted firmly. "I've waited 40 years for this moment. I won't be excluded now." "Very well," Holmes agreed after a moment's consideration. "But understand this, Captain. Any attempt to abscond with the diamonds will be met with the full force of the law. The matter has progressed beyond mere blackmail to attempted murder." "I'm no killer, Holmes," Blake protested. "I've sailed close to the wind in my time, but I've never stooped to violence." "See that you maintain that distinction," Holmes replied coldly. "Watson, will require transportation to St. Michael's Church, and bring your revolver. I suspect Harrow will be expecting us." As we prepared to depart, Edward Thornfield caught Holmes's sleeve. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice barely audible. "Harrow wasn't working alone. He has an accomplice, someone who helped him gain access to the house." "Who?" Holmes demanded. Edward's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion overtaking him. "Not certain. Suspected the gardener. Too convenient near the well." His voice trailed off as he slipped into unconsciousness. "We must move quickly," Holmes declared as we left the room. "The game is reaching its conclusion, and Harrow has already demonstrated his desperation. The family mausoleum awaits us, gentlemen, and perhaps a deadly reception." Chapter 10. Shadows. Among the graves, St. Michael's Church stood on a small rise at the edge of Kensington, its ancient stone walls softened by centuries of London weather. The morning remained overcast, a thin drizzle falling as our hansom deposited us at the wrought-iron gates of the churchyard. Holmes paused to survey the grounds. A typical English cemetery, with weathered headstones and family plots arranged in neat rows, dominated by larger mausoleums belonging to prominent local families. the Thornfield Mausoleum would be among the more impressive structures, Holmes remarked as we made our way along the gravel path. A family of their standing would ensure their final resting place reflected their social position. There, Blake pointed toward a granite structure near the eastern wall, its classical facade adorned with the Thornfield name, chiselled in bold letters above the entrance. Holmes studied the mausoleum from a distance, his keen eyes noting details invisible to the casual observer. "The lock has been tampered with recently," he murmured, "and observe the mud near the entrance. Fresh footprints despite the rain. Harrow has preceded us," I concluded grimly, my hand moving instinctively to my pocket where my service revolver rested. "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "But has he succeeded in locating the cache? That is the question." He turned to Blake. "Captain, I would suggest you remain here as a lookout. Dr. Watson and I will investigate the interior." Blake's weathered face darkened with suspicion. "And allow you to claim the diamonds without me? I think not, Mr. Holmes." "Your distrust is natural if misplaced," Holmes replied evenly. "Very well. We shall proceed together, but with caution. Watson, if you would lead the way with your revolver at the ready." I approached the mausoleum's iron door, which stood slightly ajar, further evidence of Harrow's prior visit. The interior was dimly lit by narrow windows, set high in the walls, revealing a solemn chamber containing several stone sarcophagi arranged in chronological order, the most recent nearest the entrance. "Edward mentioned his grandfather's sarcophagus," Holmes whispered, moving deeper into the chamber. "That would be the third from the rear, I believe." We proceeded cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the sepulchral quiet. The mausoleum appeared, empty save for its permanent residents. Yet I could not shake the feeling that we were being observed. Holmes seemed to share my unease, his movements deliberate, and his attention divided between our objective and our surroundings. The grandfather's sarcophagus was an imposing marble affair, adorned with the Thornfield coat of arms and an inscription detailing the deceased's accomplishments in life. Holmes ran his fingers along the base, searching for the false panel Edward had described. "Ah!" he breathed, applying pressure to a seemingly solid section. With a soft click, a rectangular panel slid aside, revealing a cavity within the stone base. Holmes extracted a metal strongbox, its surface discoloured with age, but its lock intact. "Untouched," Holmes observed with satisfaction. It would appear Harrow failed to locate the correct hiding place. As if summoned by his name, a cold voice spoke from the shadows near the entrance. "On the contrary, Mr. Holmes, I simply awaited your expertise to save me the trouble of searching." We turned to find a tall, gaunt man training a revolver on us, his thin face bearing the leathery complexion of one long exposed to harsh colonial sun. Beside him stood a shorter, stockier figure I recognized as Thornfield Manor's gardener. "Similarly armed Mr. Harrow, I presume," Holmes said calmly, the strongbox still in his hands. "And Peters, the gardener." Edward Thornfield's suspicions were correct. "Very astute," Harrow replied with a thin smile. "Now, if you would be so kind as to hand over the strongbox. My patience has worn considerably thin after 40 years of waiting." I tensed, calculating the odds of raising my weapon before either man could fire, but Holmes subtly shook his head, warning against such action. Blake had positioned himself slightly behind us, his expression unreadable as he assessed the situation. 40 years is indeed a long wait, Holmes acknowledged, making no move to surrender the box. Though I wonder why you chose this moment to resurface, Mr. Harrow. The arrangement seemed to function adequately with Blake receiving his payments. Harrow's cold eyes flicked to Blake. Because some of us were short-changed from the beginning. George Thornfield paid Blake handsomely while sending me pittances in South Africa, claiming the market for the diamonds had collapsed. His voice hardened. When I discovered the truth, that the majority of the stones were still hidden, I realized I'd been played for a fool. And how did you make this discovery? Holmes inquired, clearly stalling for time. Hargreaves, Harrow replied. The faithful butler had a nephew in Cape Town, one of my employees. Over drinks, the young man mentioned his uncle's employment with a wealthy English family named Thornfield. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. So you cultivated the connection, Holmes surmised, encouraging Hargreaves to report on family matters, searching for any hint about the diamonds. For years, Harrow confirmed, until finally he mentioned Edward's unusual interest in his father's old clock, a timepiece that had remained untouched for decades, suddenly becoming the object of his scrutiny. It was the signal I'd been waiting for. Fascinating, Holmes commented. And Peter's here? How does he feature in your scheme? The gardener spoke for the first time, his voice rough with a rural accent. My father was aboard the Star of Bengal, Mr. Holmes, listed among the dead, but he wasn't even on the ship when it sailed. Captain Mercer paid him to disappear, promised him a share that never came. So, this is about revenge as well as greed, Holmes observed. Justice, Peters corrected harshly. My mother died in poverty while these men prospered from their crimes. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, still making no move to surrender the strongbox. A compelling narrative, gentlemen. However, I fear you've overlooked a critical detail. And what might that be? Harrow asked, his patience visibly waning. The presence of Scotland Yard detectives surrounding this mausoleum, Holmes replied calmly. Inspector Lestrade is particularly eager to question you regarding the attempted murder of Edward Thornfield. Harrow's thin lips curved in a sceptical smile. A transparent bluff, Mr. Holmes. We observed your arrival. You came directly here without contacting the authorities. Did we? Holmes raised an eyebrow. Captain Blake, perhaps you would care to explain. All eyes turned to Blake, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the exchange. A complex series of emotions crossed his weathered face before settling into resignation. I suspected Harrow might be involved when Edward stopped payments, he admitted. Made inquiries of my own, and learned he'd returned to England. When Holmes revealed the butler had been corresponding with someone, I took the liberty of sending a telegram to Scotland Yard from Thornfield Manor while you were examining the notebook, Holmes. Harrow's face contorted with fury. You treacherous! Pragmatist, Blake interrupted. I'm many things, Harrow, but I draw the line at murder. 40 years of comfortable living was enough for me. I never wanted blood on my hands. A distant whistle sounded from beyond the cemetery gates, followed by the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Harrow's expression darkened with desperate calculation. Peters glanced nervously toward the entrance, his resolve clearly wavering. It seems our reunion must be brief, Holmes remarked, his tone almost conversational, despite the revolvers still trained on us. What will it be, gentlemen? Surrender to proper authorities, or add resisting arrest to your considerable list of crimes? The moment hung suspended in the musty air of the mausoleum, the fate of countless lives past and present, balanced on the decision of two desperate men. Chapter 11. The Unravelling of Time. Harrow's face contorted with furious calculation as the sounds of police whistles grew louder. His eyes darted between us, the strongbox, and the mausoleum entrance, like a trapped animal seeking escape. "This isn't finished," he snarled, suddenly backing toward a narrow side door I hadn't previously noticed. Clearly an exit for the stonemasons who had constructed the monument. "Peters, come!" The gardener hesitated, his weathered face showing the internal struggle of a man realizing he had ventured too far into dangerous waters. "Mr. Harrow, perhaps we should—" "Fool!" Harrow spat. "They'll hang us both. Come now, or stay to face the gallows alone." This grim pronouncement seemed to decide the matter. Peters moved reluctantly toward his co-conspirator, keeping his revolver trained on us. Holmes made no move to stop them, but spoke with remarkable composure. "Flight will only compound your difficulties, gentlemen. Inspector Lestrade is remarkably persistent once he has a scent." "I've evaded justice for 40 years, Mr. Holmes," Harrow replied coldly. "Africa has taught me patience and survival. England holds nothing for me now but the hangman's noose." With that, he yanked open the side door, revealing a narrow passage that presumably led to some secondary exit from the cemetery grounds. Peters followed, casting one last conflicted glance in our direction before they both disappeared into the shadows. "Should we pursue them, Holmes?" I asked, reaching for my revolver. "Let Lestrade earn his salary," Holmes replied, his attention already returning to the strongbox in his hands. "Their escape will be short-lived. I took the precaution of noting all possible exits from the cemetery in my earlier survey." As if to confirm his confidence, we heard shouts from outside, followed by the report of a revolver. Once, then twice, in rapid succession. "It would appear the good inspector has intercepted our fleeing conspirators," Holmes observed, setting the strongbox on a nearby sarcophagus and examining its lock. "Captain Blake, your assistance, if you please. You have experience with such mechanisms, I believe." Blake approached cautiously, still processing the rapid turn of events. "You're allowing me to help open it, after all that's happened?" "You've demonstrated a certain pragmatic honour today," Holmes replied. "Besides, Watson's revolver remains an effective deterrent against any rash impulses you might entertain." With a wry smile that acknowledged the truth of this statement, Blake bent to examine the strongbox's locking mechanism. After a moment's scrutiny, he extracted a small tool from his pocket and manipulated the tumblers with practiced precision. The lock yielded with a soft click. "Well done," Holmes acknowledged, lifting the lid himself. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay dozens of diamonds in various sizes, some rough, others partially cut, all possessing the unmistakable brilliance that had inspired bloodshed and betrayal across decades. Their cold fire seemed to illuminate the gloomy interior of the mausoleum, casting prismatic reflections across the stone walls. "Remarkable," I breathed, momentarily entranced by their beauty. "£3 million, Blake murmured, his weathered hands hovering over the treasure without touching it. "After all these years." "The price of 27 lives," Holmes reminded him sharply. A heavy moral burden, Captain, even if beyond legal prosecution. Before Blake could respond, the mausoleum door burst open to admit Inspector Lestrade, accompanied by several constables. The Scotland Yard detective appeared somewhat dishevelled but triumphant. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "your message was timely. Indeed, we've apprehended one of the villains, the gardener fellow, though I regret to report the other man escaped after exchanging gunfire with my officers." "Harrow," Holmes confirmed grimly. "A dangerous adversary, Inspector. I suggest you circulate his description immediately. He will be desperate now, having lost both his confederate and his prize." He gestured toward the open strongbox. Lestrade's eyes widened at the sight of the diamonds. Good heavens! The message mentioned stolen property, but this... He squared his shoulders, professionalism reasserting itself. "I'll need statements from all of you, of course, and this evidence must be properly documented." "Naturally," Holmes agreed, "though I would suggest we conclude our business here expeditiously. Miss Thornfield remains at the manor with her wounded brother, and Harrow may yet seek revenge upon them." This sobering thought accelerated the proceedings. Within 30 minutes the diamonds had been secured in police custody, our preliminary statements taken, and arrangements made for a protective detail at Thornfield Manor. Blake, to my surprise, cooperated fully with the authorities, providing detailed information about the original insurance fraud and his subsequent arrangement with the Thornfield family. "What will happen to him?" I asked Holmes as we watched Lestrade escort Blake to a police carriage. "A complex legal question," Holmes replied. "The statute of limitations protects him from prosecution for the original fraud, and blackmail is difficult to prove without the victim's testimony. I suspect he will face some minor charges, but escape the full weight of justice. Cold comfort to the families of those who perished on the Star of Bengal." We returned to Thornfield Manor to find Edward conscious and considerably improved, though still weak from his ordeal. Miss Thornfield had been informed of the events at the mausoleum by one of Lestrade's constables and received us with evident relief. "Harrow remains at large," Holmes informed them gravely as we settled in Edward's bedroom. "Inspector Lestrade has stationed men around the property, but I would advise continued vigilance." "I never thought it would come to this," Edward murmured, his face drawn with pain that seemed more emotional than physical. "Father's sins returning to haunt us so completely." "You knew of the insurance fraud?" Holmes inquired. Edward nodded wearily. "Not initially. Father revealed everything on his deathbed 10 years ago. The fraud, the diamonds, Blake's blackmail. He justified it as necessary for the family's survival during a financial crisis. But the burden of it has haunted me ever since." "Yet you continued the payments to Blake," I observed. "What choice did I have?" Edward replied. "Exposure would have destroyed our family name, ruined my sister's future. I hoped that by maintaining the arrangement, the past could remain buried." A bitter smile crossed his face. "How naive that seems now." Holmes studied him thoughtfully. "When did you decide to recover the diamonds?" "When Harrow contacted me," Edward admitted. "His demands were substantial, far more than I could manage alongside Blake's payments. I realized the situation was unsustainable." He paused, seeming to gather strength. "I spent months deciphering Father's hidden message in the clock, determined to secure the diamonds and end the cycle of extortion once and for all by eliminating Blake from the equation, Holmes noted, quoting the notebook entry. Edward had the grace to look uncomfortable. Not in the way you imply. I intended to use the diamonds as leverage, to offer Blake a final, substantial payment in exchange for his permanent silence, then convert the remaining stones to capital abroad. Eleanor and I would have left England, started fresh elsewhere. Plan interrupted by Harrow's impatience, Holmes concluded, and by Hargreaves' change of heart, Edward added. His confession and assistance came too late to alter the course of events significantly, but I cannot blame him entirely. He was caught in the same web of deceit that entrapped us all. As twilight descended over Thornfield Manor, Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. This case may be approaching its conclusion, but vigilance remains essential. Harrow has lost everything, a circumstance that renders him particularly dangerous. None of us could disagree with that assessment as night closed in around the manor, bringing with it the unsettling knowledge that somewhere in the darkness a desperate man awaited his final opportunity for vengeance. Chapter 12. The Final Chime. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a welcome respite from the persistent drizzle that had accompanied our investigation. Holmes had spent much of the night in silent contemplation, his pipe sending wraiths of blue smoke toward the ceiling of the guest chamber we had been assigned. When I awoke, I found him already dressed and alert, studying a hand-drawn map of Thornfield Manor and its grounds. "You've slept poorly, Watson," he observed without looking up. "Concerns about Harrow," I admitted, rising to join him at the window, where pale sunlight illuminated the gardens below. Lestrade's men were visible at their posts, vigilant but conspicuous in their official capacity. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "The police presence, while necessary, announces our defensive posture quite clearly. Harrow is too cunning to attempt a direct approach." "You believe he'll try something regardless?" I asked, reaching for my clothes. "Without question," Holmes replied. "His entire life for the past 40 years has been devoted to this moment. The diamonds may be beyond his reach now, but revenge remains an attainable goal." After a light breakfast in the morning room, where Miss Thornfield maintained admirable composure despite the strained circumstances, Holmes requested a private meeting with her and Edward, who had insisted on being helped to a chair in his study despite his injuries. "Mr. Thornfield," Holmes began once we were settled, "I need to understand the full extent of your father's precautions regarding the diamonds. The strongbox was secured in the family mausoleum, but were there additional safeguards?" Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Father was methodical to the point of paranoia. The clock contained the primary cipher, but he created a secondary system as well, a fail-safe in case the clock was damaged or lost." "The pocket watch," Holmes surmised. "Partially," Edward confirmed. "The watch, combined with certain notations in his personal Bible, provided an alternative path to the mausoleum. But there was more." He hesitated, glancing at his sister. He kept a detailed record of the conspiracy, names, dates, transactions, hidden within a hollowed-out copy of Great Expectations in the library. "Dickens," Holmes remarked with a faint smile. "Your father had a certain ironic sensibility." "He called it his insurance policy," Edward continued. If anything happened to him under suspicious circumstances, Eleanor was instructed to deliver the document to the authorities. Holmes leaned forward, his expression intensifying. "And does this document still exist?" "Yes," Miss Thornfield answered, quietly. "I've kept it in my personal safe since Father's death, as he instructed. Edward suggested destroying it once he learned the truth. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like the last protection we had." "A wise instinct," Holmes commented. "That document may now serve a different purpose. With your permission, I would like to make use of it, not for the authorities, but as bait." "Bait?" Edward echoed, his face paling. "For Harrow?" "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. "Harrow has lost the diamonds, but if he believes there exists evidence that could identify his confederates in South Africa, partners who presumably helped him establish his business there using proceeds from the fraud, he would be desperate to obtain it before fleeing the country." Miss Thornfield's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "You wish to use us as bait as well, Mr. Holmes?" "Not at all," Holmes assured her. "In fact, I strongly recommend that both you and your brother depart for London immediately, under police escort. Your aunt in Belgravia would surely welcome you during this difficult time." "While you remain here to confront Harrow," I interjected, understanding Holmes's strategy. "With your invaluable assistance, Watson," Holmes acknowledged with a slight nod, "and the cooperation of Inspector Lestrade, who I've already briefed on my suspicions." Edward Thornfield studied Holmes with newfound respect. "You've anticipated Harrow's moves from the beginning." "Not entirely," Holmes admitted. "The human element remains unpredictable, even in the most logical sequence of events. But I believe Harrow will make one final attempt before admitting defeat, likely tonight, when he believes our vigilance may have relaxed slightly following yesterday's partial resolution." The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation. The Thornfields departed shortly after noon, their carriage surrounded by plainclothes officers. Holmes arranged for most of Lestrade's uniformed men to withdraw visibly, creating the impression of reduced security, while in fact positioning them more strategically around the property. Miss Thornfield's document, a leather-bound journal filled with George Thornfield's meticulous handwriting, was placed conspicuously in the library, visible through the window to anyone surveilling the house. As evening approached, Holmes and I took our positions in the darkened study, with Lestrade and 2 trusted sergeants concealed in adjoining rooms. The house had been emptied of servants, creating an atmosphere of palpable anticipation, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "If I've calculated correctly," Holmes whispered as the last light faded from the sky, "Harrow will attempt entry through the conservatory. It offers the most covered approach from the eastern woods, and the lock is relatively simple." No sooner had he spoken than the distant sound of breaking glass reached our ears, not from the conservatory, but from the kitchen at the rear of the house. "A diversion!" Holmes hissed, gripping my arm to prevent movement. "Wait!" We remained motionless, in the darkness, listening intently as soft footsteps moved through the house with the confidence of someone familiar with its layout. The footsteps paused outside the study door, then continued toward the library. Holmes nodded to me, and we moved silently through the connecting door that led directly from the study to the library, in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, we could make out Harrow's tall figure at the bookshelf, reaching for the journal. "I wouldn't, Mr. Harrow," Holmes said quietly, striking a match to light the lamp on the desk. "Inspector Lestrade has a clear shot from the doorway behind you." Harrow froze, then slowly turned to face us. His gaunt features were haggard with exhaustion and desperation, a wild light burning in his eyes. More alarming was the revolver gripped in his right hand. "Holmes," he acknowledged with eerie calm, "I suspected a trap, but necessity compels certain risks." "The game is over," Holmes replied, his own voice steady. "Peters is in custody and has made a full confession. The diamonds are secured in a police vault. Your only recourse now is to surrender and hope for the court's mercy." A sound between a laugh and a snarl escaped Harrow's throat. Mercy? Was there mercy for me when George Thornfield cheated me of my rightful share? When he consigned me to decades of exile while he prospered, his hand tightened on the revolver. "No, Mr. Holmes. If I cannot have justice, I will at least have vengeance." He swung the weapon toward us with sudden violence. I reached for my own revolver, knowing I would be too late, when a shot rang out, not from Harrow's weapon, but from the doorway where Inspector Lestrade stood, his service pistol steady in his hand. Harrow staggered, clutching his shoulder as his unfired revolver clattered to the floor. His face registered shock, then a strange resignation as he slumped against the bookcase. "A fitting conclusion," Holmes remarked as Lestrade and his men secured the wounded Harrow. Though perhaps lacking the elegant resolution I had hoped for, later that evening, with Harrow on his way to both hospital and eventual imprisonment, Holmes and I sat before the fire in the Thornfield study, sharing a bottle of excellent brandy that Edward had insisted we enjoy in his absence. "A complex case, Watson," Holmes reflected, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "A conspiracy spanning decades, a fortune hidden in plain sight, and 3 men bound by both greed and mutual destruction. And the Thornfields caught in the middle," I added, "paying for sins not their own." "A common enough fate," Holmes observed, "though in this instance their ordeal has ended more favourably than most. The diamonds will likely be claimed by insurance, companies and the descendants of the original investors, but the Thornfield name has been preserved from public scandal through Lestrade's discretion." "And Blake?" I inquired. "What becomes of him?" "He faces minor charges, as I predicted. His cooperation has earned him certain considerations." Holmes's expression suggested he found this outcome less than satisfying, though he understood its necessity. "The wheels of justice sometimes turn on pragmatic bearings, Watson." As if punctuating his statement, the grandfather clock in the hall began to strike midnight, its resonant chimes echoing through the empty house. 12 measured beats marking the conclusion of both day and case. The secrets of the shattered clock are finally laid to rest, Holmes murmured, raising his glass in a subtle toast, though its echoes will doubtless linger in the lives it touched. I raised my own glass in response, grateful as always to have witnessed my friend's remarkable intellect at work, unravelling a mystery that had remained hidden within the clockwork of deceit for nearly half a century.